Juliet Capulet is a young, pretty, obedient, and quiet 13-year-old. Her inner strength enables her to have more maturity than is needed for her age. Juliet is also very obsessive and overreactive when it comes to Romeo. An example of her obsessiveness is when Romeo killed himself because he thought Juliet was dead, so she decided to do the same because she felt she couldn't continue living without him. Juliet's overreactiveness doesn't make her a very likable character. "Oh, bid me leap rather than marry Paris from off the battlements of yonder tower." This quote is showing that Juliet would rather jump off yonder tower and kill herself rather than marry Paris. It's showing how committed and in love with Romeo she is. Juliet's motivation throughout the entire story was similar to that of Romeo's and was to find a way to avoid marrying Paris because she was already married to Romeo and loved him very much. Romeo Montague is a young, handsome, intelligent, and sensitive 16-year-old. He is very emotional and obsessive towards girls he likes. Romeo is also very quick to move on from girls. An example of this is at the beginning of the poem where Romeo is absolutely in love with Juliet's cousin Rosaline. All this changed when Rosaline rejected him and was invited to a Capulet party where he met Juliet and completely fell in love with her. Romeo's passion and idealism make him an extremely likable character, although he is impulsive and immature. "Can I go forward when my heart is here? Turn back, dull earth, and find thy center out." In this quote, Romeo is questioning himself if he can move on from Juliet since he found out she's a Capulet, which is the enemy of the Montagues, Romeo's family. Romeo doesn't know what to do at this point. Does he love her or does he not? Romeo's motivation throughout the entire poem is to find a way to be with the love of his life, Juliet, without anybody interfering with him. Mercutio was one of Romeo's best friends. Sadly, he was killed by Tybalt in the battle at Verona Square where Romeo tried to separate them. Mercutio was a very talkative and humorous person who made harmless fun of others. His humor was what made Mercutio a very likable character, although he may have been a jerk at some times. "Marry, farewell. I pray you, sir, what saucy merchant was this that was so full of his ropery?" In this quote, Nurse is asking Romeo who was the guy he was with that was making all of those jokes and comments towards her. This shows that Mercutio's humor and rude comments were noticed by others. Mercutio's motivation is similar to that of Tybalt's, but instead is to show that the Montagues are more superior than the Capulets. Juliet's cousin Tybalt is a hot-headed and short-tempered character. He dislikes the Montague house very much. Tybalt is very easy to get angry. An example of this was when he and Mercutio were play fighting at the square in Verona, and Mercutio took Tybalt's sword, which angered him and caused him to stab Mercutio as Romeo was trying to separate them. Tybalt isn't a very likable character. "Uncle, this is a Montague, our foe, a villain that is hither come in spite to scorn at our solemnity this night." In this quote, Tybalt is telling Lord Capulet about how Romeo has come to the Capulet house to make fun of them when in reality he hasn't. Lord Capulet tells Tybalt to just forget about it and move on, but Tybalt can't seem to let it go. Tybalt's motivation throughout the time he lives for is to show that the Capulets are more superior than the Montagues. Friar Lawrence is a holy man who is trusted and respected by the Capulet and Montague house. This may all change after they find out that he married Romeo and Juliet behind their backs. The friar's role as their friend and advisor to Romeo and Juliet highlight the conflict between parents and their children within the play. These violent delights have violent ends, and in their triumph die, like fire and powder, which, as they kiss, consume. The sweetest honey is loathsome in its own deliciousness, and the taste confounds the appetite. Therefore love moderately. Long love doth so. Too swift arrives as tardy as too slow. In this quote, Friar Lawrence is explaining how good things also come with bad things. It just takes a matter of time for them to come, but eventually they will come. Friar Lawrence's motivation throughout the entire poem is doing anything in his power and will to end the Capulet and Montague feud for good. He also wants to make sure that Romeo and Juliet are both very happy. The nurse's key function within the play is to act as a go-between person for both Romeo and Juliet. Nurse is also the only other character besides Friar Lawrence to know of their wedding. The nurse, despite being a servant in the Capulet household, has a role equivalent to that of Juliet's mother and regards Juliet as her own daughter. Faith, here it is. Romeo is banished in all the world to nothing, that he dares never come back to challenge you, or if he do, it needs must be by stealth. Then, since the case so stands and now it doth, I think it best you married with a county. Oh, he's a lovely gentleman. Romeo's a dishcloth to him, an eagle. Madam, hath not so green, so quick, so fair an eye, as Paris hath. Beshrew my very heart, I think you are happy in the second match, for it excels your first. Or if it did not, your first is dead, or 'twere as good he were as living here, and you no use of him. Nurse is trying to convince Juliet to marry Paris because Romeo has been banished and is no use to her anymore. Nurse wants Juliet to be happy and in love, but at the same time respect her parents' rules. Nurse's motivation is to find what is best for Juliet without enraging her parents because she loves and cares about her very much. Lord Capulet, Juliet's father, is a very interesting character. He has two sides to him. At the beginning of the story, when Paris asks if he can marry Juliet, he said it's up to her and she can make her own decisions. After the first fight and the Prince of Verona says that the next time the houses fight, the heads of both households will pay, Lord Capulet changes. Once he finds out Tybalt killed Mercutio and Romeo killed Tybalt, Lord Capulet forces Juliet to marry Count Paris. The reason he does this is because if she marries him, they will have somebody close to the prince, which might result in him not having to pay the price. This is a very well executed plan by Lord Capulet. But saying o'er what I have said before, my child is yet a stranger in the world. She hath not seen the change of 14 years. Let 2 more summers within their pride, ere we may think her ripe to be a bride. In this quote, Lord Capulet is explaining to Paris how young of a girl Juliet is. He also gives him a time frame of when she might be ready to become a bride. Lord Capulet's motivation throughout the poem was to do what's best for him and his family no matter what it takes.
Soliloquy. Soliloquy is used throughout the play so that one of the characters can express their true feelings. Juliet says after the party, "O Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo?" Juliet is talking to herself and conveying her love for Romeo. Foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is used to hint to the reader about something bad that will happen. Romeo says to Juliet, "Let me be taken, let me be put to death." Romeo asks to die, and this hints to what will happen to him in the future. Imagery. Imagery is used to describe things in great detail and to build a picture in the reader's mind. The chorus says, "And she steals love's sweet bait from fearful hooks." This one line paints a picture for the reader. Allusion. Allusion is used to bring something to the reader's mind without explicitly telling you. As Romeo says, "My lips, 2 blushing pilgrims, ready stand to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss." Romeo compares his lips to pilgrims and subtly talks about pilgrims. Irony. Dramatic irony is used so that the reader knows something that the character doesn't, and it makes the scene very tense. Nurse says, "She's dead, deceased, she's dead." Nurse is screaming that Juliet is dead, but we know she is just in a deep sleep.
Over the generations, there was a family feud going on between the Montague and Capulet houses. Romeo Montague and Juliet Capulet are to take their own life caused by love, as it was explained in the prologue. The Act 1 starts off with the two houses fighting and the prince calling them off. The fight between the two houses is a man versus man external conflict. In the Montague's house, Romeo is struggling with himself because of his love for Rosaline, which is a man versus himself internal conflict. To cheer Romeo up, Benvolio and Mercutio took him to the Capulet party. At the party, Romeo and Juliet met and fell in love at first sight. Through Nurse, they discover that their love is from the house of their enemy. In Act 2, Juliet confesses her love for Romeo in her balcony, thinking that she was alone. This is a man versus himself internal conflict. However, Romeo was listening and ended up planning their marriage for the next day. Secretly, Romeo and Juliet married with the help of Friar Lawrence and the Nurse the next day. That same day, in Act 3, Tybalt killed Mercutio while Romeo was trying to stop their duel. Romeo avenged Mercutio by killing Tybalt, which caused him to be banished from Verona. These are all man versus man external conflicts. That same day, in Act 3, Tybalt killed Mercutio while Romeo was trying to stop their duel. Romeo avenged Mercutio by killing Tybalt, which caused him to be banished from Verona. These are all men versus men external conflicts. Romeo trying to kill himself, thinking that being banished is worse than death, is a man versus himself internal conflict. To make matters any worse, Lord Capulet arranges a marriage for Juliet and Count Paris. Juliet refuses to marry Paris because she was already married to Romeo. This leads to Act 4, where Juliet asks for Friar Lawrence's advice to be with Romeo and not marry Paris. Friar Lawrence gives Juliet a potion that will make her appear to be dead for 42 hours. He told her that when she wakes up in the Capulet's tomb, Romeo and he will be there to watch her wake up. But first, she had to agree to marry Paris. Excited by Juliet's new decision, Lord Capulet moved up the marriage by a day. Before taking her potion, Juliet wonders if the potion will work or not. If it didn't work, she would kill herself with a dagger. This is a man versus himself internal conflict. The next day, Nurse discovers Juliet dead, and soon everyone believes her to be dead except for Friar Lawrence. In Act 5, Romeo doesn't receive Friar Lawrence's letter saying that Juliet isn't actually dead. Furthermore, Balthazar tells him that Juliet is dead. Romeo curses the stars and buys a strong poison from an apothecary. In Act 5, Romeo doesn't receive Friar Lawrence's letter saying that Juliet isn't actually dead. Furthermore, Balthazar tells him that Juliet is dead. Romeo curses the stars and buys a strong poison from an apothecary. Then he breaks into Capulet's tomb where he found Paris. Paris calls Romeo a murderer and blames Juliet's death on him. Eventually, they fight and Romeo wins. This is a man versus man external conflict. Romeo says his last words to Juliet and drinks the poison. A few minutes later, Friar Lawrence arrives and Juliet wakes up. Realizing that Romeo had committed suicide, Juliet kills herself with Romeo's dagger. The next day, Friar Lawrence confesses everything that has happened to Prince and everyone else. To honor Romeo and Juliet, Lord Montague and Lord Capulet promised to raise a statue for them. The family feud had finally ended with the deaths of Romeo and Juliet.
The house of Lord Capulet is one of the most important settings. This is where Romeo and Juliet met at the Capulet's party, and this is where the love between Romeo and Juliet starts and makes Romeo forget about Rosaline. This is also where Juliet faked her death, which changed the plot because otherwise she would have had to marry Count Paris. The main obstacles in this setting are Lord Capulet and Tybalt. Friar Lawrence's cell is where Romeo and Juliet were married, which makes them more connected and more in love than before. This is also where Friar Lawrence comes up with the plan for Juliet to fake her death. Both of these are parts of what leads to their deaths. The silence and solitude benefits Romeo and Juliet because they can talk freely. The Square of Verona is where the first quarrel between the two families was, which shows the reader how serious the feud is between them. This is also where Tybalt fights and kills Mercutio, which causes Romeo to kill Tybalt and be banished. This causes Juliet to fake her death, and eventually Romeo and Juliet commit suicide. The obstacles of this setting is that it is a public space for the community. In the tomb of the Capulets, Romeo and Juliet both commit suicide because they can't live without each other. This causes the feud between the families to end. The obstacles of the setting are other people being there and getting in the way, like Paris and Friar Lawrence.
One of the main themes in Romeo and Juliet is obviously the struggles of love. Throughout the entire play, both characters, Romeo and Juliet, made many sacrifices for their love. They went even as far as killing themselves. The entire story focuses on the struggles of their secret relationship. Another powerful theme is the pain of death. The entire play is filled with death. First Mercutio, and all the way until the death of Paris at Juliet's tomb. The presence of death is very highlighted by Shakespeare, by almost all of the main characters getting killed or taking their own lives. From a man named Apothecary to an underhanded move, the power of death is very prominent throughout the whole play. Another thought, maybe think before you get secretly married behind your parents' back at 13.